Everybody, welcome to camp. Welcome to another edition of Urban Talks. As you probably know, camp is closed again, and it's due to coronavirus situation in Czech Republic and all around the world. The thing is that this room, actually this is our entrance, is normally very busy. So now we have some space to show you what Center for Architecture and Metropolitan Planning looks like. This is our cafe. People normally waiting here for their drinks before the event starts. And this is our white room. And there is my colleague Pavla sitting after one of our participation events. This is used for conferences, and it's something like normal office room. But we used to have some exhibitions there. I think it was focused on architecture of the year, architect of the year, and this is our building. It's quite dark here, but whatever. We will prepare some commented guide here to show you architecture of Karel Prager. And this is our library and our bookshop. If you are an employee, you can borrow the books, but you can read them and spend some time here for free, of course. It's open area. And this is our black room. This is the best thing of camp, I guess. It's 25 meters wide projection wall. It's the biggest in Czech Republic. And there are 4 projectors or 5 projectors synchronized to show you whole street in 1:1. You can see white areas here, for example, brown fields, and it's quite effective. And here are our touch screens, and this is newest exhibition. You can vote here for your priorities, 25 priorities of Prague development. You can vote here for the most important project, in your opinion, for example, new bridges and brownfields, whatever. Now we will start with our lecture. I'm here sitting in front of Bryan Boyer. Hi, Bryan.
Hi.
Welcome to Center for Architecture and Metropolitan Planning for camp. How are you today?
I'm doing well. How are you?
Yeah, I'm great. I'm alone here. Where are you now? Are you in Detroit or New York?
Yeah, I'm in Detroit, and then the rest of the Dash Marshall team are in Brooklyn.
Yeah, so you're based in Brooklyn and Detroit. Why is that? What's the reason?
Well, I'm the one that moved away from the office. So I moved to Detroit for personal reasons with my partner a few years ago, and we thought it would be an opportunity also to open up some new opportunities in a different place.
Yeah, so you're talking about the rest of the team. I will say that Dash Marshall was founded by Amy Young, Ritchie Yao, and you in 2009. And there is one question. Who is Dash Marshall?
I'll share a little bit about that in the presentation, but Dash Marshall is our mentor, basically, somebody that we work in his memory. He passed away many years ago, so we like to think that we work in his honor now.
Great, I'm looking forward to the story. And I just mentioned that you are assistant professor of practice and director of the new Bachelor of Science in Urban Technology degree at Taubman College of Architecture and Urban Planning. It's under the Michigan University, am I right?
Yeah, University of Michigan, exactly.
Yeah, so do you spend a lot of time there in university, or mostly an architect in your studio?
You know, it's 50-50, right? So half my time is in the office on our projects, and the other half is at the university now creating this new program. So we'll have our first students in that program next year, actually. So there's a lot of work, as you can imagine, right now.
Yeah, thank you. May I ask you if there is something that changed about your work at university during the coronavirus situation? Is that difficult for you?
Of course, it's quite different now. The courses are primarily online, although there is some stuff happening in the building still, the fabrication labs and things like that, and some of the studios are still meeting in person with some precautions, but for the most part, yeah, it's very different, as it is everywhere.
Yeah, I understand most of our lectures are online right now too.
Yeah.
So great, I will ask you for a presentation, and after that there will be some space for question answers from our listeners. I will just ask that you can ask Bryan questions on slido.com, and he will answer them. I will see the questions and I will ask them about, and that's all. Please, Bryan, start.
Cool. Well, just first of all, thank you so much on behalf of the whole Dash Marshall team. We're very happy to have the opportunity to share our work, especially during the coronavirus. We've all been, literally inside our homes, or at least here in the US, we've been inside our homes for so long. It's nice to feel connected to other places in the world, even if we're not traveling there in person. So just thank you so much for having us and giving us the chance to share the work. So I'll speak on behalf of the team today, and going to show some of architecture, some strategic work that we do, and then a few of our ongoing experiments, for lack of a better word, things that we don't, they don't fit easily in another box. So Dash Marshall, as a studio, we like to think of ourselves as working from the smallest details that feel just right in the hand to the perfect place to read a book during the afternoon, to thinking about what happens when you orchestrate experiences through a building, and of course, in the urban realm as well. So we're working between architecture and more what we call strategic design, which is really even before there's a brief, before there's an idea, before there's a building, helping clients think about the implications of things like technology or new businesses, new governance even, and what that might mean for the city. So we're really concerned with the rituals and the kind of human experience. Everything we do, no matter what the scale is, comes back to the questions of people being together, people sharing their experiences in a home. We're very interested in the role of function and the way that architecture can perform or do things, and also help people do things differently. But we equally are interested in mood, right? So you can make the most functional space possible, but if it doesn't have an impact emotionally, then it's going to be still quite boring. And so we're trying to balance all of these things in our work. We're really obsessed with detail, especially when we started our office as youngsters kind of just out of school. We chose to be as focused as we could on getting things built, because we enjoy what we talk about as the matter battle, right? Which is the kind of the fight that happens when you're trying to produce something like a staircase here that you see, which is made out of aluminum, steel, and bronze. But we're equally, even though we're very detail oriented and very into how we make things, we're also not afraid to laugh at ourselves and to have a good time with it. So I hope what you pick up in the work is a sense of humor or at least a feeling of life. So the projects kind of range different scales. And as you mentioned in the introduction, we've been doing this for about 10 years. So I thought I'd start with some of the architecture just to give you a sense of the projects. And the work that I'm going to show today are things that are either just completed or kind of ongoing at the moment. So it's primarily things that are not on the website. The first is a project called View Stand. So we were invited to a competition in New York City in a neighborhood called Hudson Square, which is, if you're familiar with New York, it's next to Soho. And it's honestly a kind of sleepy neighborhood at the moment. There are some large old buildings that are being converted to offices, and there are a few residential towers and things, but it's going to see a lot of growth in the next couple of years. And so the kind of what we call a business improvement district that looks after that neighborhood was interested in bringing some life back to the streets during the coronavirus times. And they commissioned 3 architecture studios to make proposals for the public realm. So where we started was thinking about the real experience that we've all had of our streets being emptied of life, right? So this is a shot of Times Square that was taken at some point during the pandemic that we're all still dealing with now. And it's completely or almost completely devoid of people. I mean, if you've been to Times Square, it's kind of shocking to imagine it this empty. And at the same time, the social issues and the civil rights issues that have been on discussion in the US and elsewhere this summer has been one of the most inspiring movements that we've been part of in our lifetimes, and hugely important. So what we see is that even though the streets are empty, there have almost never been more voice or more expression of opinion and perspective in the public realm. And so we wanted to balance that with this feeling of, kind of what we call doom scrolling, right? Like looking again and again at the news, which is worse and worse every day, and instead find a way to connect people to each other. And so the way that we think about that is actually the newsstands, like this image that you're seeing on the screen now, are one of the ways that humans have connected to each other through hearing about what's happening either across town or in another country. And so we wanted to bring this kind of perspective or news-based communication back to the public realm. And the way that we're thinking about that is through creating a newsstand in Hudson Square. And there are, of course, places where you can buy the New York Times or buy a paper, this type of thing. But what we were interested in doing is creating a feedback loop between citizens and their peers, right? So connecting citizens to other citizens. And so the newsstand on the right-hand side is collecting inputs, and on the left-hand side is giving away the kind of results of those inputs in the form of a newspaper. And I'll show a little bit more about that in a minute. So we're giving away newspapers that are essentially collecting or aggregating thoughts and opinions from people that have been submitted either in writing or via social media. So we're sending out a call to say, what are you thinking about in terms of the future of democracy? What are you thinking about in terms of joy in this moment? How do you find joy during the pandemic, right? Your life is upside down. Or an important topic that we haven't in the US had really a proper way to deal with because our president is such a disaster, is how do we grieve? We've lost more than 200,000 people, and yet we haven't had a public expression of grief. And so we were looking for a way to kind of bring these types of conversations into public. And the thought was that what we need to do is to really give people an opportunity to contribute their viewpoints or their points of view, and then to reflect that back to them, almost like a mirror to society. So the structure that we proposed is this open air newsstand. It's basically an A-frame with some light gauge steel, and it's open to the air for health purposes. It's also meant to be very portable and quite easy to deploy, quite cheap to produce. We like to think that it looks kind of like a smile, or maybe kind of like a taco, but it's meant to be friendly and to create a kind of scene around it, which, frankly, will be much more common in a place like Prague or elsewhere in Europe, where you have people enjoying public space. In America, public spaces are often motivated by buying something. There's some kind of craft fair, or there's some kind of food market or something, and we don't typically make as much use of public spaces just as a place to be with your peers or with your fellow citizens. And so that was one of the interests here, is to kind of bring people back into public space, but in a safe way and with a kind of alibi or with a purpose for that participation. So as I mentioned, it's pretty simple structure. It had to fit inside of a parking space to be plausible in the rules of the competition and kind of in the way things work in New York. And one of the things that we're particularly interested in here is the way that the structure, although static, interacts with the media. So as the newspapers are being taken by visitors, the structure starts to take on a different appearance. And what we were hoping to do was produce almost, the question was, can we make a building where the walls are media and nothing else? In the ideal case, the building completely disappears when the voices are gone. And so that's what we were striving to do in the design of the project. If we switch gears to a very different project in a very different location, the Micromix is a mixed-use building, and the name comes from our intention to design the smallest possible mixed-use building for an American city context. So in Detroit, we have a lot of neighborhoods that look like this. What you're seeing here on this street corner is a field of grass, and that field of grass used to be about 2 or 3 houses and a church. And those houses and those other buildings have been abandoned, and the buildings fell into disrepair, and then the city demolished the building and leveled it into just a field. If we turned around and looked the other way, we would see multiple blocks, full city blocks that used to be homes and businesses and are now completely empty. So Detroit has actually quite a lot of land. It's lucky as a city to have plenty of space. And yet at the same time, that presents a challenge, right? So how do we get a feeling of density and life when there's so much air between the different things that are happening? And the intention with Micromix was to say, well, one of the ways that we can bring more activity is by really cramming program together, right? By having people living and working in the same space. In this situation, by doing that near an urban farm where there's other kinds of activities, other kinds of rituals going, and to try to create a moment of density, even though the city, this particular part of the city is missing that. So this is another view you can see on the left with the building footprints are in gray. And so you can see kind of to the left of the square, the red square, that there's plenty of open space. And on the right-hand side, with the colored in site plan, the building that's in white marked with a asterisk or a star is what we're talking about. So it's about a 200 square meter building. It's quite compact. It's mostly a ground floor with one space up above and one small basement. And in all of our work, we're trying to produce architecture that can be appreciated without knowing anything about architecture, right? Like ultimately, we want to make spaces that are great for the families that are living in our buildings, the companies that are working in our buildings, the visitors who are passing through those spaces. It needs to be great on a visceral human level, and that's the most important test. But as architects, we also need to find a way to keep ourselves motivated and interested, right? And so the kind of historical or architectural historical interest for us is a continual thread that's running through the work. And in particular with this project, Ritchie was really interested in these dolmen structures and the kind of top heaviness of them. And so what we see in the design of the building here is an attempt to exaggerate this band across the top that's executed with metal shingles, so the part that's white, and the bricks down below kind of holding up that levitating mass conceptually. The other thing that's happening here is that the ceiling and the roof assembly of the building is exaggerated, so that on the facade, it ends up looking like a kind of a smaller building than it is. But what happens inside is that it lets us collect light and bring light into the depth of the space in a creative way by essentially routing it through that thick roof assembly. So we'll show some images of that in a minute. But this is basically the same vantage point as the prior slide that was showing the empty grassy lot. From the other side, the building takes on a slightly different character with a larger mass. And this is also something that we're kind of constantly looking at in the projects is how do we make room for a plurality of interpretations? We like it when the things that we put into the world are as complex as the world itself. And same thing here. So this is looking straight onto the building. There's a bit of inspiration from some of the other architecture that's happening nearby. Detroit's kind of, the peak of Detroit, I guess, in terms of its power or its sway in the world might have been in the early 20th century. And so we're kind of making a connection to the Art Deco era of some of the structures from that time that are not too far from the site here. So the building is conceptualized as a kind of 7 days a week space, and we're trying to cram a lot in. So there's a office / library, perhaps like a very, very tiny version of what you described at camp. The intention is we'll move our studio in Detroit to this building. And so we'll operate it as our office, but on the weekends, on Saturdays, it will be open for events for the design community and also as a library for people to come and use the books and use it as a research facility. One of the things that we're also interested in is bringing people to Detroit and having a space for them to stay. So the bedroom that's upstairs is designed as a residency so that people can come and stay for a few weeks. Perhaps we'll have a visitor from Prague someday, and that we have then room also for a nice gathering so that we can get to know each other or have a more social experience when people are here. So the building is organized around a courtyard. It has a kind of interesting, or I think, let's say, carefully studied set of relationships in the corners. And here again is where we come back to our fascination with what we think of as studying history or studying, kind of the heroes of the past. We're hopeless fans of Kahn, and the Fisher House in particular was one of the things that we're looking at for this project. Fisher House comes up a lot in our office, actually. So what we end up with then is a series of spaces around a courtyard. And you can see in the back of this image, the kind of light well almost that's going across the top is an example of what I was describing earlier of us bouncing light through the thickness of the ceiling. And if you look kind of in the distance of the image, there's a man he's wearing all black and carrying a white tote bag. And above him is another example of us bringing light through the assembly of the ceiling into the space in an unexpected way. This is a view on the other side. This is from the kitchen, although we're missing the kitchen in this view. And again, here there's some kind of intricate play between the upstairs, which is pulled back from the actual facade to create a light well that comes down to the kitchen. Looking on a project, on this aspect of the project, also a lot at the work of John Sohn and the way that he brings light into spaces in unexpected ways. And you can see just a glimpse of it through the courtyard, the way that the spaces start to layer onto each other. Because this is a very compact building, so it's quite easy to kind of see through it and feel connected across that courtyard. So that project is about, again, 200 square meters. This project, Detroit Public Theater, is in the neighborhood of 700 to 800 square meters. We're in the middle of this at the moment, kind of finishing some of the construction documentation. As you can imagine, like everybody else, the coronavirus situation has made the project progress a little bit challenging. But what we're working on is a new home for the Detroit Public Theater, which is a local theater group that was founded a few years ago and they like to think of themselves as a regional theater. So it's not just, some people who are into drama and they're putting on a show. These are really high quality performances made with very good actors, a mix of which are local. They kind of combine, probably about half of their actors are local and the other half are coming from out of state. So it's a great opportunity for Detroit to put itself on the map in terms of the performing arts. And we've been working with them to design their first permanent home. So prior to this, the Detroit Public Theater has been operating in a borrowed space. And that's good, but it's never as good as having your own structure. So what we're looking at is a building from 1908, 1910, something like that, which was built at the time as a garage. So this is one of the first purpose-built automotive garage buildings in the world. At a time when the car industry was booming here in Detroit. And this is what it looks like today. To call it a humble structure would be a real compliment. So it hasn't been loved very much, and it's nothing special, frankly, but it has its own presence and its own history. And what we like to do when we enter a project like this is to ask ourselves, how do we keep the history that's there, even if it's a mundane or a humble kind of history? And so, for instance, when we went on the site visit to the interior and we saw a scene like this, one of the things that's quite interesting is the way that the trusses provide a little bit of personality, right? So the open web trusses, they're out of plumb, they're not in great shape. Our engineers were having a real headache when they came to see this stuff. And yet it's the thing that probably gives the interior space the strongest identity. And so what we're interested in doing is finding a way to maintain that and to nourish that and to lift that up as part of the experience of the theater. And so what we're looking at, one of the starting points for the project is a kind of inversion of the idea of poche, right? So usually in a classic theater, like the Garnier Opera, the poche was meant to hide all of the enabling factors like the structure, and instead to create this fake world down below. But Detroit is a place that prides itself on having a lot of grit and being okay and thriving through a very challenging past. And so it doesn't feel right in Detroit to hide anything. If you come to visit Detroit and you talk to people, they're going to tell you their opinion of everything, whether you ask for it or not. So we want that to be reflected in the architecture. And so the idea here is to create a kind of ceremonial space at the level of the trusses that's continuous from front to back of the building. And by doing that, whenever you're inside the Detroit Public Theater, whether you're in the front of the building on the left or the back of the building on the right, you're always under one roof, right? So that's a kind of an obvious statement that as soon as you're inside a building, you're under one roof. But the idea was, how do we make it feel like, how do we make it communicate to people that they always know that they're under a continuous kind of structure unified by those trusses and the wooden ceiling that's above. So the building itself is quite simple, actually. There's a bar, cafe, and bathrooms and things like that in the front. And there's the green room and other production spaces in the back. And in the center is a black box theater. So it's a big empty room, probably not too dissimilar from where you are today in Comp. But you can bring in the seating and the stage however the theater company would like to do it at the time. So it's quite flexible in that sense. And it's designed to work as a black box theater in many different configurations, but it's also designed to provide them the opportunity to do other types of events. But what I want to show here, I'm going to click through these images quite quickly. This is a massing model, but the green in the image and the diagram will show you the continuity of the ceiling that's over our heads. So even from outside the building, we can already see the original structure and the trusses. And as we move through the space, that ceiling is continuous. We're always having it within our field of vision. It's always present. And so even from the outside, we can see it. The green band that goes across the middle is the kind of division between the inhabited zone down below and the ceremonial space of the trusses up above. So when we're inside, again, we can see the trusses kind of continue into the distance. And the thing that's important to point out here is that there's a visual continuity between the lobby and the theater. So usually when you go to the theater, you have the lobby and it's completely sealed off from the actual performance area. And what we felt was that's actually the opposite of the way that things should be done at a place like the Detroit Public Theater. The goal here is to make the theater itself as connected as possible to the city. And so we want to do that we want to do that visually in the same way that the theater company themselves do it spiritually. And so the thing to focus on, I'll highlight here in white, which is this area above the wall that separates the lobby, the foyer, from the theater itself. And it's quite hard to see in this image, but basically we have acoustic glazing at that point. So even though we can see kind of over the wall and into the black box theater, it's completely sealed off as a separate space. And what happens is traditionally in a theater, you come into the performance room and then we open the curtains onto a new world. And in our project, we're inverting that. So in this project, the curtains are open by default. And we only close the curtains for just the time that we want to be separate in our own little bubble of theater. So just at the time that the performance starts and in the white box area is when we close the curtains and then people funnel into the performance. And so in that sense, again, what we're trying to do is to invert the tradition of the theater and to find another way to make a ritual around this experience of joining a performance with your peers and neighbors. So when you're inside, you're secluded, the glazing is keeping it acoustically isolated and the curtains are keeping it visually isolated, but it's only for the moments of the performance, and otherwise we open everything back up. Okay, so I want to show also just one project as an example from our strategic design work to give you a sense of the types of things that we're balancing in the studio. And these projects are, more than anything, they're about helping people figure out what to do. And so before showing our project, I wanted to share just a historical example, maybe to give this a little bit more context. So there's a municipality in Denmark in the 1950s that had a very popular public pool. And the pool started to be used less and less. And so the town elders came to the facility and they looked at it and they said, oh my gosh, the pool has fallen into disrepair. No wonder nobody's coming here anymore. It looks like crap. Who would want to come swim here? It looks unsafe. So clearly what we need to do is to fix the pool. And so they went out and they hired an architect. The architect came on the site visit, looked at everything, took note of the condition, and then went back to their studio. And a few weeks later, when the town elders were gathering for the presentation of the architect's findings, the architect said, I want to talk to you about this, which is a bus schedule. The problem is not that the building has fallen into disrepair. The problem is that you've changed the bus schedule so that it's impossible to get to the pool while it's open unless you have your own car. And what this brings up as a kind of parable or mythology is the notion, or maybe the reminder, that as architects, in a traditional sense, we only have certain tools to solve the problems of the people that we're working with. And sometimes a building is the right tool. So for Detroit Public Theater, they absolutely need a space of their own that they can host their performances in. but not all clients or not all partners are in a place where the building is going to be the answer. And yet, as architects, we understand what happens when dreams kind of land in reality, and when those dreams start to bump up against the reality of the world. And so I think our ability to see both possibilities and realities and to balance those two is actually quite useful in the 21st century. And so that's the kind of work that we're doing in the strategic design practice. So for instance, we completed this project called The Most Important Mile, which was for the Mindaroo Foundation. So Mindaroo is an Australian foundation. They do a whole bunch of work, but one of their initiatives is around the future of technology. And in particular, thinking about how technology can be made more empowering of decent work, how it can be practiced in a way that's more respectful of local laws and local context. Because right now, a lot of the, if you think about something like Uber was developed by folks in Silicon Valley and kind of pushed onto the rest of the world. And there are some really great things that have come out of that, but there are also some really negative downsides, like all sorts of taxi drivers whose lives have been upended, all sorts of congestion or other systemic effects that have been experienced in cities because of this sudden influx of use of platforms like Uber. So the Future Says initiative is an attempt to think about alternative ways to use technology that are more empowering of local communities and local contexts. And so what we produced for them, this was between Dash Marshall and the Star City Group, which is a consultancy focused on urban planning and smart city issues run by our friend Anthony Townsend. We collaborated on a set of scenarios which are included in a small book. And so The Most Important Mile, each one of the stories is dealing with kind of a different alternative future for how things like instant delivery could be utilized in places like Berlin, Australia, and Brooklyn. So for instance, in one of the stories set in Australia called Postify, what we were looking at is what is the role of the national postal service in a country like Australia, and could we find a way for the postal service to become a kind of enabling platform for all sorts of other delivery businesses, that some of them might be using autonomous vehicles and drones, others might be using cargo bikes and carrying things by hand, right? So this isn't about like a totally shiny, everything's flying, flying cars are everywhere kind of future. It's really trying to be a balanced and humane approach to things. So the projects are presented as stories, but they're stories that are written for policymakers. So the details of the stories are pulled through a foresight and research process. So we're looking at what's happening in the world now, like the rowboat, which is a project from Amsterdam, and like RideFair, which is a co-op taxi model from Australia, and like Mobility as a Service, which is a technological platform that's already in use in Finland. We're looking at signals that are out there. We're collecting them and synthesizing them in the same way that architects do when they begin a research process for a new building or a new project. And then we're asking ourselves, what happens if we press fast forward on these signals? What's the future that we imagine when these things become more normative or more common? And so the story is presented, it's just in a few pages, but what we're trying to do is make it a connection between the reality of the technology and then also the political and economic context of society, right? And so this story in particular is asking about the way in which a national delivery network essentially would allow a country to respond to crisis in a far more agile way than how we're currently doing it. If you want to figure out how to not respond to a crisis, come study America, because we've done a really great job at really messing it up this year with coronavirus. And then the stories, ultimately, these stories are, they're not just sci-fi, right? It's not just to kind of escape current reality. This is meant to provoke our partners in public sector. So mayors, ministers in national government, people who are leading foundations, people who are leading NGOs. What we're trying to do is basically push them to be more demanding of technology, more forward-thinking in how they apply technology to meet human needs. And so the stories end with a kind of a thread from some of the details that are in the story to what that might mean from a policy perspective. So, for instance, if we're talking about the data streams that would come out of a national delivery service, like right now, the Postal Service has, if they wanted to, they could tell us where all sorts of different packages are, what's in those packages, where they came from, where they're going. That could potentially be very useful if we needed to, say, suddenly locate all of the masks in a country. It could also be very invasive from a privacy standpoint. And so what we're trying to do is illustrate the types of tensions or questions that policymakers need to grapple with if they are going to make the most out of the technologies that are in front of us. So, okay. At the risk of giving you whiplash, I thought we'd also show some of the experiments that are underway in the office. And experiment is a kind of collect all term because we're going to look at some software and also some products and well, actually also the story of Dash Marshall. So as we started in the discussion, there was a question about who's Dash. And we've had, Amy and Ritchie and I, when we show up to meetings with people who we're just beginning to work with, from time to time, we've had this question, like, why isn't Dash here? Why am I getting the junior people, not the figurehead whose name is on the door? And Dash Marshall started as three of us working together actually remotely. So I was based in Helsinki and Amy and Ritchie were based in New York. And this is a screenshot from one of the first meetings that we had. You can see this is the corporate formation document that I guess we were having some comments about. The office started as just three of us. And we, at that point, were just a year or two out of grad school. So, we were very young. We started the office for our first project, which was a residence in Kips Bay, which is an IMPay structure in New York on the east side. A really amazing complex. And we had the opportunity to design just a one-bedroom apartment in that space, which we conceptualized as a spaceship that was kind of blasting out of the space station dock and going off into the cosmos. So this project became an opportunity for us to create an office, which we did because that's, in America, you have to have a corporate entity to do work like this, or at least that's the smart way to do it. So we said, okay, let's make the corporation, even though we just have the one project. But after that one project, it turned into two, and after two, it turned into four, and the projects kept going. So these days, we're about 5 people. Amy and Ritchie are here, as well as Francesca, who's another one of our team members. My head's cut off. And then you're seeing some of our interns, Brandon and Jen here. This is from a holiday party years ago. But so this is the team that's Dash Marshall. And you notice that there's no actual Dash person, right? There's no old man here named Dash. And what we came to was, at that time, architecture firms, I don't know if it's the same in the Czech context, but in the US, when we started our firm, what we noticed was everybody who was starting new companies or new design studios were choosing these really grandiose names. So I've made these ones up, right? But the Institute of, but it's one person in their underwear at home. The office of, but it's one person in their underwear at home. the bureau, the this and that. And so we just felt, okay, fine. I get it. What people are trying to do is to convey a sense of confidence, but they're doing it by kind of making up a story that implies a certain scale or a certain reach that just isn't true when you begin an office. And we thought about another way or alternative ways that we could kind of play with that idea of confidence, right? Architecture is ultimately, it's an investment by the people who are building something new or creating something new. And of course, it's perfectly reasonable that they want to have confidence that they're working with good, professional, stable people. And so the thought was, who's more stable than the kind of archetypical, like 1940s, 1930s, American, like dashing gentleman. And the notion of this was to say, okay, like that's the person that is usually expected when you call the architect. So let's just be that person. And Dash Marshall, the name came from actually an interest in being like as dependable as General Motors, right? And so even our first logo was a direct kind of interpretation of an early General Motors logo. But Dash Marshall, you know, we took it really far. As we talked about in the introduction, we used to tell people that he was our mentor and that he was from Australia and he had this long career. And then he came to America and he started the practice with us and then he died. So that's why you can't meet him, because he passed away. But in actuality, it's just been a way for us to kind of play with this question of how people find confidence in their collaborators and to honestly kind of provoke the stereotypes here. So of course, people expect the white man, the like elder white man to be the one that shows up. But the reality is that the reality is actually much more interesting about what's happening in contemporary architecture. It's still too white and too male, but what we see is the right trajectory. And so we wanted to be able to play with this question as an office and make that part of also our identity, is to constantly be questioning the status quo, even in the way that we formulate our collaboration. One of the things to pivot to, although this list has a lot of old white dudes on it as well, but to pivot to another experiment, as you've heard me talk about the projects, we're constantly looking at references and using our reading of architectural history as a starting point for our work. Whether or not we communicate that to our clients or frankly, even in a conversation like this is another question, but we're trying to make sure that the ideas and the way that we explore the projects are in dialogue, both with the needs of the people who will use them and the history of our discipline, of architecture. And so a few years ago, when we put together a book, we took the opportunity to actually make this table that you see here of who were the influences on each of our projects. And so this idea of like heroes or studying the past is something that's a constant presence for us. And it comes up in the strategy work as well. So in the strategy work, we're doing a lot of workshops and kind of participatory processes, usually with folks in government, you know, so it's kind of a little stiff, or it can be sometimes. And we're trying to help them understand design as a way of seeing and working through problems. So one of the quotations that I come back to often when I'm leading those workshops is this notion from Eliel Saarinen, who's Eero Saarinen's dad, that we should always design a thing by considering it in its next largest context. So he talks about a chair in a room in a house in a landscape, and a landscape in a city plan. Now, that sounds like Gesamtkunstwerk, right? That sounds like a very particular moment of architectural history. And we don't mean it that everything needs to have exactly the same curve and exactly the same palette of colors. I think we're all beyond that era of architectural thinking. But what's important here is that ideas happen at different scales, and that we can't just think about the big scale, and we can't just think about the small scale, but we have to be able to connect the small to the large and the large to the small. So this is a really important notion for us. And when we're doing these workshops with people where we spend either a whole day or sometimes even a few days or a whole week with folks, we're really pushing them to think about, usually like if you get an economist, they think about it only way up here. They don't think about the consequences for people at the everyday level, right? And so we're really pushing them to move back and forth between different scales. And at the end of it, what we want to do is kind of mark that moment or that experience that we've just gone through with them, where they have this new perspective on how they do their work and how people like designers can help them do their work. And so we created a gift to give away at the end of those sessions. So the pin here is, it's literally an icon of the Saarinen quote with the chair in the room, in the house, in the landscape, and the city plan. And we created these for a workshop that we did in Japan. But because you have to buy 200 of them as the minimum order, we thought, oh, well, we can also sell them. So now we sell these on our web store, which has been kind of an interesting experiment to see as well. What are the other forms of revenue that we can bring in as an architecture office? Do we have to always wait for a client to come and bring some thousands of dollars as a project, or can we do something that's as small as $10? And what does that mean for us as an office, and how do we manage that? And there's a whole set of questions there. So this has turned into a small series. The next one is from Cedric Price, who spoke, I think, very eloquently about some of the confusion that gets attached to technology, right? Everybody wants technology, but what are we trying to do with it? Why does it matter? Or as he put it, technology is the answer, but what exactly was the question? And I love this photograph of him with these glasses with windshield wipers on. It's kind of the best example of technology answering something without a proper question first. So, okay, fine, let's make that into a pin. So this was the second pin of the series. And it's an interesting exercise, to take some, let's say, wisdom from whatever source is relevant to you, and to try to condense it to the smallest token possible that can serve as a reminder. How do we create for ourselves new rules of thumb, right? That don't require a whole bunch of study, or don't require us to remember some elaborate reference or, some book that we read, but like literally something that you can carry and pin to your shirt or to your bag that's always with you. And so this has been a kind of frivolous experiment, but I think an interesting one for us to work through. And then the next experiment is something that happened kind of by accident. This a product called the Global Architect Card. So I was traveling with my partner, who is an attorney, and she's very patient, and she lets me try to get into all sorts of random buildings. So when we were in Torino in Italy and wanted to see a project by Carlo Molino, and I was begging in like very broken, terrible Italian to the security guard to let us see the building. And eventually he got it, and he's like, okay, go over there. Like, the thing that you want to see is over there. And it was a very beautiful suspended staircase. And so Laura said, you need a card like the FBI, right? I'm an architect. I'm here to see your architecture. And so the thought was to create that card. And so we did. It's size of a credit card. It's made out of metal with the text that's etched onto it. And it has, I am an architect. I'm here to see the significant building in 14 languages. So I forget the exact calculation, but we figured that it should let you communicate your intent to a few billion people. Czech isn't on there, I'm sorry, but in a lot of other places it will be useful. And so the idea, again, was like, this is very easy for us to produce. It seems like an intriguing possibility. Let's see what happens. And so we've been selling these on our store as well. And I think we're now into, I think we've sold around 400 or something like that. So this is not going to be a business that this is not going to replace our office, but it's been a true experiment in terms of finding ways to balance or supplement the other things that we're doing. The other thing that I think is nice here is that it's an opportunity to do something much faster than traditional architecture or urban planning practices, right? So we can have an idea and execute it in the span of a week or a few days or at most a month, when in our architecture, it takes that month or more just to sign the contract. And so one of the things that, well, I should let Amy and Ritchie speak for themselves, but like personally, I find this kind of hunger to do things on a faster clock speed or faster cycle speed, and have ways to keep up with the changes in culture and in society more broadly by doing things other than just making buildings. So that leads me to the final experiment. And sorry, I've lost track of the time, so you tell me if I run out of time. But People Party is a project that we are working on currently. So People Party is an app, and we're building an app to populate renderings with scale figures. So as architects, we spend so many hours on making the rendering. And then in like the last few minutes before the presentation, you're like, shit, we got to put people in the rendering so that the client understands how big the building is and it looks like it's a lively place. And so the idea was to basically solve a kind of labor issue. It takes a lot of work to find the right people, to cut them out, to put them in the scene, to do all of that. And if you're smart, you utilize your own library. So, we have a folder of people that we drag into all of our Photoshop files. But it means that our renderings have the same characters again and again. It's like no matter where the rendering is in the world, we have the same people who are, I guess they're super fans of Dash Marshall and they've visited all of the structures. So the idea is, how do we make an easier way to fill the renderings with people? And how do we do it with far more generative possibility, right? So it's not the same people again and again, but it can respond or give us the ability to respond to different images. And so the way that we start is with the app has basically a library of people inside of it that are illustrated. And then we add an image and we can say, okay, we can resize all of the people. I'm not showing it here, but you can kind of drag and drop and resize people as needed. But then because they're illustrations and because it's an app, we can also say, let's change the color of all of the pants, or all of the t-shirts, or all of the shoes, or all of the clothing in general. And that's controlled by a palette. So what we're trying to do is get out of the mode where you take a paint bucket and you one by one kind of say, I want this person to have this color t-shirt and this person to have this color pants, and make all those decisions, because basically, even though those are small acts, they add up to a lot more thinking than anybody really needs to do. The ultimate question is, does the image look lively? Does it look like a party? And the way that we're working here is essentially applying colors to the crowd of people that are in the scene in one go. So we can say, we don't like those colors. What about these colors, right? Or we can say, that's nice, but actually what's not working for me is, well, I'll show you in a minute. One of the things that is important is we're not just changing the clothing colors here in the app, but we're also solving another issue, which is something that's quite pressing in the US. So often what happens is people make renderings and the racial identity of the people in the renderings doesn't match the place, right? So Detroit is a city that's 80% Black, and the renderings often, like this one, are just not. Like, all the people in this image are white, as far as I can tell. I'm sure there's some people of color somewhere in that crowd down below. But basically, the folks in this image don't represent Detroit. This might physically be in Detroit, but it's not the community of Detroit. And my argument would be that this doesn't happen because somebody's explicitly trying to make a statement. It happens out of laziness. right? That it's hard to find a representative set of images, especially when they're wearing this particular jersey of what's the hockey team here in the city. And so one of the things that we're doing, which you'll notice, it says 6 people in Detroit. So we pull the census data, which talks about the different, the population in each American city and the percentage of white folks and black folks and Asian and Hispanic and other races. And we use that to generate then the population for the image. So basically the software completely eliminates this question of who are the people. We just do it based on the reality of the world as seen through the census. Now that's not perfect. There are all sorts of issues with the census, but it's far better than where we are now. Because it's software, we can also do things like this and say, yeah, that person is great, but actually I'd rather have a slightly more energetic pose. So let's change it to that. So we're trying to make it very facile for an architect to author the scene in the image. Again, as it has some, what we think are interesting benefits in terms of the representation or the identity that comes out of it. But the starting point is really about making your life easier as an architect. And again, I don't know the context in Europe, it's a little bit easier, I think, to get interesting projects built than in the US because people actually have some appreciation for the quality of architecture in public space. But here, it's such an effort to get anything interesting built that we feel like anywhere that we can make our life a little bit easier actually gives us more reserve and more strength than to go fight the important battles, right? So rather than fighting with the stupid stuff that's not really key to our mission as architects who care about the public realm, let's instead simplify the things we can so that we have the muscle where we need it on the harder battles. So this basically, the app then in the end lets you export and download a PNG file that goes straight into Photoshop, right? So the final rendering can be put together very easily. And again, it's with this idea of sort of accelerating the things that we can make easy. I have to say that if you're interested in this, you can sign up now at peopleparty.app. It's open for signups. The app itself will be released either later this year or early next year is our plan. Okay, so with that, we've reached the end of the experiments, and I just want to say thank you again for having us, and I hope there's something interesting here in the work that we've shown for a conversation today.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. I guess I will use People Party. We have empty space, and we need to put some people here. Exactly. And we have a lot of pictures from the city, and we will be happy to use it. So I will be interested in it. Thank you for your presentation. It was really interesting. I have a few questions. First is it right that you are sitting in Lafayette Park? By Mies van den Rohe?
Yes, he has good eyes, yes. This is Lafayette Park.
Wow, it's amazing. It's an amazing space. How is it possible that you have an office there?
So it's coronavirus, so I'm working out of my home. And
so you live there?
For people who don't know, Lafayette Park is a neighborhood in Detroit designed by Mies van der Rohe. There's a series of townhouses and then a few towers. So I live in one of the townhouses.
Wow, that's amazing. Because, you know, Mies van den Rohe built an Villa Tugendhat in Czech Republic. So it's something unbelievable that you can live in his building.
Yeah, well, actually, I convinced my partner to go with me to visit Tugendhat as research for this project. And so we went, we were in Vienna, and so it wasn't too far to make the visit. And of course, it's an incredible project. But what was interesting is that we found there's almost nothing in Tugendhat that translates to Lafayette Park because it's completely different. You know, Tugendhat is like the most refined private residence, and Lafayette Park is like middle-class housing is how it was designed. Yeah, it's far more efficient and humble in terms of the materials and things. It's actually quite nice to see those two different ends of Mises.
Yeah, and Tugendhat is older, so there are different influences and different time. I enjoyed your e-shop. It's great that you sell things, and I think that you won't need card in Czech Republic because we are scared of abroad people. So we will let you in because we want to avoid talking with abroad people. I have questions on Slido, and for our viewers that you're watching Urban Talks with Office Marshall, and you can ask questions on slido.com if you will use hashtag #CampuOnline. Sorry, there's another camera. You will be able to ask us a question. And now I have one question that is, I think it's in the context of the situation in Detroit. After the crisis, Detroit was in a really difficult situation, and I guess it still is. I think there will be a lot of brownfields and spaces like you showed us, empty spaces after demolished buildings. Does that change, or did that change the city's focus on development, on planning the city, urban planning, and is there some difference between planning the buildings in the city before the crisis and after the crisis?
Yeah, I mean the question about, sorry, by crisis, do you mean the economic crisis?
Yeah, economic crisis in 2009, yeah. I guess, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so the history of Detroit is that its peak was, well, actually, people talk about the globalization of the auto industry as the thing that kind of pierced the balloon of Detroit, right? Detroit was this rising city. Originally, at its peak, it was planned for 2 million people. Its highest it was planned for, I think, more than 2 million people. It kind of, it went up and then it came down to now we're at 700,000 or so. And so, that's quite a difference, right? And you can tell, so when you drive around the city, even though tons of buildings have been removed, as I mentioned, what tells you about the prior density here are the number of church steeples. So you drive around and you see all these churches, and if you stop and think about it, there are far more churches than you would need for the amount of people that are left here. And that speaks to how dense it used to be. So, there used to also be on the corners, like on intersections, there would be, instead of single family homes, there would be multi-level apartment buildings. And a lot of those are gone or decaying, or sometimes you just have that building and everything else around it is grass. So obviously there's some reactions to, before you would have planned for a very different level of density, but it's been decades since Detroit had that level of density. It's been a multi-decade long decline. And so from a planning perspective, I guess the thing that has been underworks in the past few years is a move towards thinking about Detroit as a polycentric city. And so neighborhoods become rather than saying, let's try to bring it all back, which to me feels almost impossible without some kind of very dramatic economic change. But instead, let's focus the effort in more concentrated areas. So in a prior time around the bankruptcy of Detroit, which is now, coming on eight or so years ago, the prior focus was, okay, it's the whole city versus downtown, right? We'll put everybody into downtown and focus all our effort there. Well, that has all sorts of problems as well. I mean, one of them is you just don't have the housing stock downtown that you would need to really do that, or even in the area right around downtown. And the other is that downtown compared to the rest of the city, so basically Detroit is a black city, but the downtown is disproportionately white. And so that's read as folks saying, folks read that as, you're telling me to leave my home where my grandmother grew up, where my mother grew up, where I grew up. Screw you, right? Just to solve your economic problems. So the more current way of working is to think about how we can provide some kind of, or how the city can provide, I should say, some kind of anchor of stability in the center of the different neighborhoods. And I think what is left unsaid is that then between those centers, you end up with areas that will look far more like the grassy lot that I showed. And there'll be, there will be parts of the city that are more natural or rewilded even, kind of in and amongst some of the remaining structures. There's quite an interesting urban fabric here.
Yeah. So you are based in Detroit and your colleagues are based in Brooklyn. Do you see some clash between your, your ideas or, style of planning or style of architecture? Because you are in a different city, surrounded by different people, and they are in a very dense city, you know what I mean. Can you see that they have some other sources for inspiration, for example, or other ideas?
Yeah. You realize you're talking to an architect with two architect business partners, right? Like the whole thing is about a clash of ideas. We have for 3 people, for any one question, we have 15 answers. So I don't think that's about being in Detroit and Brooklyn. I think that's just about, it's about the way that we work. We try to, as much as possible, we try to approach projects without preconceived ideas. Of course, everybody comes with their own bias and their own history. But we try to start things by listening really carefully to what people say they want to do. And sometimes that's really detailed and specific. Our clients tell us, I want exactly this, and we have to work to kind of undo that or open up a broader space of possibilities. And other times they're really vague, and therefore we have to work to fill in the gaps. And I think the strength of having the 3 of us as partners and the 4 of us or 5 of us as the team in the office is that we try to operate as a non-hierarchical flat team. We try to operate as a group of 4 or 5 people who are working on a problem, not as some co-founders and some employees. Because I think, that speaks to the complexity of what everybody's dealing with now, whether you're in a place with the history of Detroit or you're in a place like New York with the dynamism and activity that's ongoing there. Like there's always something that makes life complicated. So we have to lean on the strength of the whole team to understand issues.
Yeah. We have also a message from Dash Marshall. He enjoyed the story. He enjoyed the story and say, take care, guys. So real Dash Marshall is here. And we have a question from Linda. Do you reuse some of your past urban planning projects ideas in new projects, or are they tailor-made every single time? So you showed us the map, the list that maps your sources of inspirations for every project. Do you have some system? Do you have something that you reuse again and again?
Yeah, I think, this, on a personal level, I feel like this is one of the challenges of the contemporary architecture world, is that there's this feeling that everything has to be new, that every project from the office has to be invented from scratch. And it's not helping us as individuals, right? We put a lot of effort into creating new ideas, and then you happen to not win the competition, or the client happens to choose the other idea. And so we have to throw all of that out because our peers would think that it's not cool that we reuse something. I mean, it's a total bullshit approach to your work. It doesn't honor your work, right? So regardless of whether you start with project A and you invent some new idea, or project B and you invent that idea, at the end what matters is the idea and whether it's appropriate or not. So if we can take something that didn't work here and apply it over there, then absolutely we should do that, because again, that's a way of honoring all the effort and time that we put into it. Now, if we were able to charge much, much more for our fees, then you could expect us to invent new things all the time. But the reality, again, in the US is that the fee structure is not set up that way. So we do try to reuse things in 2 ways. So the first is, for instance, the newsstand that I showed. We didn't win the competition, but we you can be sure that we will be trying to reuse that somewhere and propose that in other contexts. I'm sure it will take some slightly different form, maybe a different shape, maybe different colors, maybe a different idea for the newspaper, but we'll keep those ideas alive because they're things that we're interested in. The other thing that we do in reference to the table that I showed is, kind of constantly nurturing relationships with certain architects, right? So somebody like Venturi that we look at a lot might show up in a project a few years ago and then come back in a project today, and we're looking either at different angles of the work or reinterpreting the work. And I think that kind of conceptually similar to evolving a detail over time, right? The first time you develop a detail for a curtain wall that actually works the way that you want it to, you would be silly not to reuse it. And you'd also be silly to reuse it just in the exact same way, rubber stamping it again and again. So of course we want to evolve things, but it's part of a learning dialogue with ourselves or with our own work that I think is important.
Yeah. What about a tailor-made new idea for a whole city? What if, for example, Detroit will find an architect that will find a new idea for a whole city and will spend the time rebuilding it? Do you think it's possible? Because you said that Detroit is lucky, that it has so much free space right now, so it has some potential. Do you think that's possible? Because a lot of European cities and famous cities around the world are influenced by one architect only, or few architects, the biggest stars of their era. Do you think that's possible for Detroit, that they will find their architect?
Well, so there are a few complexities to it. I mean, the biggest one is just on a practical level, the US doesn't have, the public sector in the US, the government doesn't have the same level of muscle that you have in a European context. So the planners are working at a further distance from the actual things that happen out in the city, right? Which means that their influence over the results of the city they're less distinct. I mean, they still obviously have an important role, but it's not as strong as in Europe. I think the bigger thing is the idea of a single person planning a city, or even a single office planning a city, either sounds like a really boring city, or it sounds like a very patriarchal approach to making urban environments. To me, I think that's a kind of legacy that we need to shed, is this idea of authorship. Like currently the architecture and planning practices are fighting against the idea that they're the single author of things, right? So there's a big push to use participatory means and methods, participatory processes to bring people in and have input on things. That happens in a certain way, kind of at the end of the process, right? That's like, hey, we're gonna build a park here. Should we have 3 jungle gyms or 2? Should they be blue or red? Should it be themed like a fire truck or like dinosaurs? So I don't mean to demean those choices. Those can be really important. If you're the child that lives next to that playground, of course you'd wanna have an influence on it. But the bigger question is, what are we doing in the first place with our money, right? As a city, we're all contributing tax dollars. What are we doing with those tax dollars? So I think there are questions about the role of design in the structures of governance that go even beyond planning, that we need to think about how we as a society, or as societies, retool government so that government can enable people to have their own conversations and make their own decisions without relying on this distant decision maker, which feels like a 20th century or a 19th century model that just isn't as appropriate today.
Yeah, great. I have few questions from Marie. I guess maybe she's from Detroit, because she's asking about the financial situation of the city. She said that Detroit received some around $250 million in federal support in 2013, and she's asking if the current coronavirus situation, coronavirus crisis, can influence the situation in the city, in context of development. If it's a possible problem for using the money for construction new things.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to find out one way or the other. I can just speak to the experience we've had in the office. You know, we've had 4 projects running through coronavirus, of which one was completely put on hold, canceled. 2 of them are going forward much more slowly and hesitantly than they were before, but they will get completed. And the final one is some of the public process in terms of the approvals has been very slow. It's been disrupted by the coronavirus. So, you know, I think that's, I think what that tells me is the experience is going to be mixed, right? I mean, the economy just before coronavirus happened, I was already seeing a slowdown in some of the larger construction projects here in Detroit. So for instance, downtown, there's a very large skyscraper that's being built. It's under construction now. And there was a second project of similar kind of scale. And that one is still coming soon, even though they haven't even put one shovel into the ground, right? And so I think that what we saw is that Detroit went through a long period of very little construction, very little building, to a period of quite rapid growth and expansion, or new construction at least. And the construction was really geared towards a luxury end of the market, right? Like quite expensive homes, either to purchase or to rent, and offices for big multinational corporations. But what the city has in far more numbers are people who are not at that level, but looking to start their first business or looking to buy their first home. And so I think one of the challenges that we have here is kind of right-sizing or balancing the market so that the options that are available for people are across a wider band of opportunities, not just the kind of like what's going to pull suburbanites from the areas around Detroit.
Right. Thank you very much for your talk. Thank you for your lecture. It was really interesting. I enjoyed it all. And I hope we will meet someday in life.
Yeah, me too. Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much. So that was Bryan from Dash Marshall, and I hope you enjoyed the lecture. You will find the record on YouTube, and I hope you will stay with us. We will be back with next Urban Talk next month, I guess, maybe this month, I don't know, but I'm looking forward to meet you again. So have a good night.